study hard. Let's get to our questions. Question 51. Lewis wants to be a Formula One race car driver when he grows up. Lewis is very fast when he is driving his car around the track, but he is slow to start the race. The race starts when the lights at the starting line turn green. What dimension of behavior should we be most concerned with given this information? Okay, pretty straightforward measurement question. It's a continuous measurement question based on the answer choices. Continuous measurement, we're measuring every instance of behavior. In this case, what are we looking to measure? Well, we know that Lewis is fast when he is driving his car around the track. So if we were measuring duration, we might measure what duration it takes him to get around the track. But that's not what we're concerned with. We're concerned with his speed at starting the race. Our question says he's slow to start the race. The question says the race starts when the lights at the starting line turn green. So we know from the time the lights turn green to when Lewis starts moving, that's what we need to speed up. And if we're concerned with the lights turning green to Lewis starting to move, we're concerned with what? We're concerned with the time in between the SD and the response. And if you're worried about the time in between the SD and the response, what are you concerned with? Are you concerned with A, inter-response time? Inter-response time, of course, is time in between two responses. We're not measuring the time in between starts. We're measuring one instance of a start from the SD, which is the lights turning green, to Lewis starting. So we're not worried about multiple responses and time in between multiple responses. We're simply worried about what? We're worried about latency. The time from that light turning green to Lewis starting is our concern. Now, what about frequency? Frequency is simply a count. We're not counting any of Lewis's behaviors. And then we just went over duration. We're not worried about Lewis's duration. We already know he's very fast driving around the track. We're much more concerned with the time it takes him to start once the SD signals it's time to start, the SD being the starting light at the starting line turning green. 52. Your best friend is telling you a story about how your other friend caught a 300-pound fish the other day. Your friend describes it to you in great detail down to the time and location. You respond by saying, "I'll believe it when I see it." What attitude of science are you adhering to? All right, interesting, right? You're just being a good scientist. Oh, a 300-pound fish? There's no way. You say, I need to see a picture. I need to see the real thing. I'm just not going to believe it until what? Until you observe it. So when we're talking about attitudes of science and we're talking about observation, what are we specifically talking about? Are we referencing parsimony? Parsimony is the simplest explanation, is the right one. Had you said there's no way you caught a 300-pound fish, you might be using parsimony because the simplest explanation is your friend is lying, right? But instead you say, okay, I'll believe it when I see it. So when I observe it, I'll believe it. So we're looking at observation here. So what about determinism? Determinism just says behavior is lawful. It says the universe is an orderly place. We are concerned with behavior happening for a reason. In our question choice, are we concerned with behavior happening for a reason? Not really, right? We're just concerned with observing this fish our friend claims to have caught. So we look at C, empiricism, and empiricism is essentially observation. We make judgments based on things we observe in our environment. So if you say, I'll believe it when I see it, you're saying, okay, I need to see it with my own eyes first. I need to observe it. So when we talk about things like direct observation and functional analyses, we're talking about empiricism, right? This is empirical observation, right? So C looks like our best answer. On our exam, do we just pick the best answer, the first one we see, and move on? No, we read all of our answer choices. So if we look at D, experimentation, are we experimenting with our friend? Are we experimenting with this fish? No, we're simply saying, I need to observe this. I need to see it. I need empirical data, empirical references that this fish exists. So what attitude of science are you adhering to? You are adhering to empiricism. Okay, 53. Which of the following scenarios would not be considered a consequence intervention? What's the most important word in this question? Not. You need to be very careful. These not questions, these accept questions, very easy under pressure, moving quickly to miss this. It's why you need to read the questions very carefully. This not changes the whole question. It's asking us to find basically something that isn't a consequence intervention, meaning 3 of these will be consequence interventions. Okay, be very careful. So in this case, let's find the 3 that are consequence interventions and pick the one that isn't. So not considered a consequence intervention. What is a consequence intervention? A consequence intervention is reactive. We're reacting to a behavior that just occurred. Okay, we're delivering typically some sort of type of punishment or reinforcement, right? An antecedent intervention is typically preventative. It happens before the behavior. So we're looking for 3 answer choices that are consequence interventions. A, Brenda will typically scream and cry until she gets her iPad. Today, after school, Brenda cried for 20 minutes before her mom gave her the iPad. Pretty clear consequence intervention, right? We see it every day. Kid screams and cries, mom gives iPad. Very common consequence intervention, reacting to the behavior. B, Jackie buys his team pizza, but only if they commit less than 4 penalties in the game. What is Jackie doing? Jackie is simply setting up a contingency. If you commit less than 4 penalties, then you get pizza. Jackie is reacting to what his team does. It is a consequence. What about C? Davy's neighbor loves sweets, so Davy will randomly bring over baked goods to his neighbor's house. Is Davy reacting to something that happened in the moment? Well, no. Well, this word randomly implies what? It implies that Davy will he knows his neighbor loves sweets, but his neighbor doesn't necessarily need to do anything to gain the sweets. If anything, this might be non-contingent reinforcement, right? But Davy isn't necessarily reacting to anything. There's no consequence going on here. So compared to A and B, this is definitely not a consequence intervention. So far, C is our best answer. Let's check out D. D, Jay's car won't start, so he pops his trunk to take a look at the engine. Why does Jay pop his trunk to take a look at the engine? Because his car won't start. Simply a consequence intervention. It's reactive. So therefore, C is obviously our best choice as to not being a consequence intervention. Davy's randomly bringing over baked goods, not based on his neighbor's behavior. All right. Davy just knows his friend loves sweets. So whenever he feels like it, he'll bring over baked goods. Our answer is C. This is not considered a consequence intervention. Again, be very careful with that word not. It can throw you off. 54. Michael manages the customer service department at the company where he works. Michael is always training his employees on the importance of answering the clients quickly when they ask a question. As it relates to the question and the answer, Michael is most concerned with what? What does Michael want to do? Michael wants to speed up his employees, right? They need to answer the client quickly. So from the time that the client asks a question to the time the employee answers the question is what we're concerned with. So if we think back earlier, what was our answer then with Lewis and the green light? We were concerned with latency, right? The SD to the response. Well, that seems easy. Let's just find latency. If we go to our answer choices, we'll see latency is not an option, right? So we need to start thinking a little deeper. Now, IRT, we know is what? We know it's time in between 2 responses. Are we worried about the time in between the responses of the service department? No, we're worried about that question in the moment getting answered quickly. So we can eliminate IRT. What about frequency? Are we worried about how many questions they answer? Not necessarily. We're just more worried about answering the clients quickly. Magnitude. Are we worried about the intensity of the answer, right? Again, not necessarily, okay? We need them to respond as quickly as possible. So if we look at this word contiguity, okay, typically this word is used in relation to consequences, especially reinforcement. We want reinforcement to happen as close to the behavior as possible. That's what contiguity means, right? Closeness. When a behavior happens, we want a consequence immediately. The longer we go before delivering that consequence, the better the chance is we're going to either reinforce something else or not reinforce something at all. So if we're worried about closeness, right, the closeness of the employee's answer to the client's question, we're going to be worried about contiguity. A, kind of a tricky question, right? Remember, on the exam, you need to be very open-minded, okay? Don't get rigid in your thought pattern, okay? Again, the most important part is knowing terms and definitions, right? Knowing terms and definitions is more than half the battle. If you know terms, if you know definitions, the test becomes so much easier. Okay, 55. Anne lives with her foster mother, Marilla, in Green Gables. Anne is an energetic girl who talks constantly throughout the day. Anne's BCBA recommends an intervention that involves putting the constant talking on extinction. Marilla informs the BCBA that she doesn't agree with that intervention and that she doesn't think she wants to use that strategy. How should the BCBA respond? When you're faced with this situation, it can be frustrating, it can be difficult. You're the professional, you're the BCBA, you worked hard. How dare they question your procedures? But think about it from their end. Extinction isn't easy. Extinction can be very difficult. Why? Extinction burst. We can predict that the behavior is going to increase at first. So if you have to live with that every day and you know the behavior is going to increase, extinction can be very difficult. So Marilla's honest with the BCBA and says she doesn't really think she wants to use that strategy. What do you do? How do you respond? A, implement the strategy against Marilla's wishes and take data to see how effective it is. Are we just going to blatantly go against the wishes of the foster mother? Absolutely not. Part of our job is collaboration. The stakeholders are involved. They have a say. We need to take their opinions into account. So A is certainly not the right answer. B, allow Marilla to pick and design her own intervention. Now, are you going to let someone untrained just design her own intervention? No, if she could do that, why would she need you? Okay. So A is too far on one side of the spectrum. B is too far the other way. Let's find something more in the middle. C, put the client on probation for not complying with the treatment plan. Again, absolutely not, right? It's Marilla's right to not agree with the treatment. D, pick an intervention that is suited for the environment. Sure. You always want to take into account your environment, your RBTs, your stakeholders, the client, what's available to you. What might work in one environment might just be a total disaster in another, simply due to resources or people implementing it, right? Your interventions need to fit the environment. The better fit, the better outcomes. So in this case, if you know Marilla isn't going to do the intervention, don't do it. Okay, you're just going to be wasting time. She's actually doing you a favor. So instead of just going against her will or allowing Marilla to pick, find an intervention more suited for the environment, something that Marilla will follow through with. So how should you respond? D, pick an intervention that is suited for the environment. 56, ideally, IOA should be collected how often? So IOA, inter-observer agreement. This one's kind of tricky. You know, depending on where you look, this number can change. So this is kind of the gold standard of IOA. IOA, of course, is when we get 2 or more parties collecting data on the same behavior or same intervention, comparing that data to check for fidelity, basically, right? Are we measuring the same thing? Are we getting the same results, et cetera, et cetera? How often should you collect IOA data? Should you collect data 10 to 20% of sessions? Not quite enough, okay? What about at least 50% of sessions? It's probably too much. So we have 25 to 30% and 25 to 40%. Now, this is kind of one of those questions where you just need to know. Okay, there's no real trick to it. The preferred answer is going to be 25 to 33% of sessions. Okay, that's just kind of the gold standard. Again, IOA can be tricky. If the test asks you, go for 25 to 33%. Okay, you really want to take IOA about, as it says, 1 every 4, 1 every 3 sessions. Okay, enough to where it matters, enough to where you'll be able to really determine, okay, am I taking the right data? Is my measurement correct? Are we measuring the same thing? Is my data accurate? Is it reliable? Is it valid? That's really the main thing about IOA. You want to be taking it enough to where it's useful. If you're taking it 10% of sessions, that's just not going to be useful enough, right? I mean, error alone could make that invalid. Long story short, just go by the gold standard of how often IOA should be taken, 25 to 33% of sessions. 57. You're working as a BCBA managing a caseload of 8 clients. Yesterday, you learned that one of your RBTs has been conducting parent training once per week without telling you. What would be the most appropriate way to respond? Big no-no. RBTs are not trained. They're not authorized to conduct parent training, especially without your permission. So you're probably pretty mad, right? You want to react. But how should you respond? Remember, you rely on your RBTs, okay? They're part of your team. They implement your treatment. You're only as good as your RBTs. So you need to be careful about how you treat them. You find out they're doing this. How do you respond? A, reprimand the RBT immediately. Do you just go in there, guns blazing, embarrassing them in front of the client, punishing them without finding out what happened, without providing feedback, without giving them resources? No, right? It's way over the top, okay? What about B? Provide the RBT with feedback on what they did incorrectly as soon as possible and refer to them to the RBT task list. Absolutely. We all want to get better. We all make mistakes. Maybe the RBT didn't know. Maybe they forgot. Maybe they just had a brain lapse. Who knows? Instead of jumping all over them, give them feedback. What did they do incorrectly? Refer them to the RBT task list so that they can get better. B is definitely a better answer than A. Can we find a better answer than B? C, provide the RBT feedback next time you see them for supervision and refer them to the RBT task list. What makes B better than C? Well, it's going to be the immediacy, right? We want prompt, instant, constant communication. You know the RBT messed up. If you wait till the next time they supervise or you supervise them, they might continue making the same mistake. You want to correct it as soon as possible. That's what makes B better than C. And then D, assume that it was a one-time mistake and that it won't happen again. The last thing you want to do is try to avoid conflict, try to avoid bringing these things up. You want to address them. That's what a good supervisor does. Okay. You use behavior analytic principles to provide good supervision and good training to your RBTs. So if you know your RBT that conducted parent training without your permission, give them feedback as soon as possible, refer them to resources that are going to make them better. Okay. Supervising is an important role. It's a big responsibility. You want to do your best, all right, to provide your RBTs with the best guidance possible. 58. How long should a behavior analyst wait to discontinue an intervention? One of the beauties about what we do, about ABA, about being a BCBA, is that your treatments are fluid. They're organic. We don't get married to a treatment. The only thing we're concerned about is optimal outcomes for our client. So when we get this question, how long should a behavior analyst wait to discontinue an intervention? What are we going to pick? Are we going to say, well, at least 2 weeks of collecting data? Think about your time maybe as an RBT, working in a school. Do you always need 2 weeks to figure out something's not working? No. Sometimes you know immediately, okay? Sometimes you know just right off the bat, this is not effective. So what about at least 3 sessions of collecting data? Well, let's think about sessions. Maybe one day I had a 3-hour session. The next day I left early for the doctor, so I only had a 15-minute session. The next day I had a makeup, so I did 5-hour session. Those sessions aren't very consistent, right? So a hard and fast rule of 3 sessions isn't really precise enough. What about C? Whenever there's enough data to indicate that the intervention is unsuccessful. Absolutely. You should be taking data on everything. We know this. As soon as the data indicates that an intervention is not successful, whenever that might be, we discontinue it. We don't marry interventions. We don't get attached. We move on, try to find the best outcome possible for our client. Finally, D, you should try to avoid discontinuing interventions whenever possible. Absolutely not. We move quickly. We are looking for socially valid, meaningful outcomes. If that means adjusting intervention after intervention, so be it. Adjust until you find one that works. 59. Jariah participates in therapy on Saturday mornings around 10 a.m. Sometimes Jariah will tell his mom that he is tired and cannot work. When the therapist asks the mom how they are doing today, the mom tells her Jariah is tired and cannot work. This is an example of a and what. Okay, if we're looking at our answer choices, this is a mentalism question. We have explanatory fictions, hypothetical constructs, and circular reasoning. We're not dealing with non-contingent reinforcement here, so we can eliminate D. So what kind of mentalism are we dealing with? Remember, we don't handle behavior in terms of mentalisms in ABA, okay? Now, commonly, behaviorism, is a branch of psychology, but we're not concerned with the mental aspect. We're concerned with what? Things we can observe, things we can see. So let's break these down, right? Explanatory fictions and hypothetical constructs kind of go hand in hand. Hypothetical constructs are things like ego, laziness, things that we can't really observe, but labels that we give to certain behaviors. Can you observe ego? No, but you might say, well, you're just being egotistical. Can you observe laziness and frustration? Not really, right? But you might say, well, you're just being lazy today. You're just being frustrated today. Okay. So, with that said, what is an explanatory fiction? Explanatory fiction is basically using a hypothetical construct to explain away behavior. If Jariah's mom says he's sleepy, that's our construct, okay? And she uses it to explain away his behavior, she's using an explanatory fiction. A little confusing at first, okay? The main thing is understanding really what a mentalism is and why we avoid them. So our answer here is going to be A, an explanatory fiction. Now, what is circular reasoning? Circular reasoning is basically using the cause as the effect and the effect as the cause. What do I mean by that? For instance, if I say Timmy can't read and you ask me why, and I say because Timmy has a learning disability, and then I turn around and say, well, Timmy has a learning disability, and you say, what does that mean? I say, well, he can't read. We're just going in circles and circles and circles. We're not really explaining anything, okay? The cause is the effect is the cause. Don't get too confused by this. Know what mentalisms are, know the three types, know why we avoid them, okay? But don't confuse yourself. In this case, we're explaining away this behavior with the fiction that Jariah is tired, he cannot work. Our answer here is going to be A.